Hi there, I'm Noah Alden Hardaway, and I'm so glad you decided to tune in to today's program about Schumann's Humoreske and the German Romantic novel. Before I get started, though, I wanted to thank Natalie Nedvetsky for doing such a wonderful job of putting together the literary music series, and also, in particular, her responsiveness to the Black Lives Matter movement. Last week, she and Llewellyn Sanchez Werner put together a program celebrating the works of African American poets and classical musicians, basically overnight, canceling the program they were planning to do in response to what's going on in the US and actually the world now. All these incredible, uplifting protests. Today, however, remains very white, this program, and I seriously had considered canceling. But I was thinking that maybe while we're virtually gathered here together, there's a little bit of good we can do. If you look in the comments, you'll find a series of links to BIPOC artists and arts organizations with donation links. If you leave a comment with which fund you chose and how much you chose to donate, I'll match the first $50 in donations. This is just one of 1,000 things that we should be doing, steps that we need to take. Another thing would be to buy some of the amazing anti-racist books on the New York Times bestseller list, for example. But I thought putting our money where our mouths are would be a good start. So yeah, once you've donated, just leave a comment, please, so I know where to make the matching donations. Okay, so today's program, Schumann's Humoreske and the German Romantic novel. Of all composers, Schumann may have had the profoundest love for literature. As a teenager, he was a lot more invested in his literature club than his law studies. According to his roommate, Schumann never went to a single lecture. Instead, he spent his time improvising at the piano for hours and writing poetry and fledgling novels. Many of these written efforts were imitations of Schumann's literary idol, the quixotic German author Jean Paul. It's hard to overstate Jean Paul's influence on Schumann. The young composer read over 4,000 pages of the author's works and often reread them later in life. At 18, Schumann wrote in his diary, quote, "I've often asked myself where I might be had I not gotten to know Jean Paul. Yet he seems on the one hand to be interwoven with my inner being, as if I had an earlier premonition of him." End quote. The next year, he said, quote, "If the whole world read Jean Paul, it would certainly be a better, but unhappier place. He's often brought me close to madness, but the rainbow of peace and of the human spirit always hovers delicately over all the tears, while the heart is wondrously elevated and tenderly transfigured." End quote. A decade later, in a letter about the Humoreske, Schumann even said that he, quote, "learned more about counterpoint from Jean Paul than any music teacher." End quote. You might be wondering what kind of writing could possibly prompt this kind of obsession. And Jean Paul's novels are quite an experience to read. It's kind of like navigating through a bramble of nutty metaphors, satirical inside jokes, hyper-sentimental scenes set alongside utter banalities, asides within asides, within asides, and it never lets up. Scholar De Vario put it this way, quote, "Jean Paul stubbornly refused to adhere to the accepted principles of unity of plot, if only because he passionately believed that life itself was a motley, variegated affair. Hence the plethora of digressions, excursions, embeddings, interpolations, and appendices. However disorienting they may be, these devices serve to affirm what was an essentially epic worldview." End quote. But if I were to sit here and read you enough Jean Paul to pick up on all of that, I'd be talking at you for too long. So I thought I'd pick a few excerpts just to give you a little bit of context. Jean Paul's breakout hit was the novel Hesperus, or 45 Dog-Post Days, written in 1795. Although ostensibly in the mold of the 18th century sentimental novel, Jean Paul's premise is typically bizarre. The book's imagined author-narrator, named after himself, but this time a mining superintendent, lives on an island which is simultaneously near Singapore and within dog swimming distance of Germany, since the plot comes to him in letters delivered by a swimming Pomeranian. Anyway, on the 11th dog post day, there are preparations for a marriage. But the chapter opens with this insane free association succession of metaphors that seems to have nothing to do with anything. Then he gives a tiny sliver of actual plot, about as much emotional nuance as two shots in a silent film, followed by a narratorial aside about hyping up how excited the reader must be, getting comfortable, smoothing out the pages, filling up a pipe. And that's just the beginning of the chapter. The actual action of the chapter is framed as a quote, historical benefit comedy of the marriage of the princess in 5 acts. Which is interrupted by, what else? An interlude titled, quote, an extra leaf upon the greater freedoms enjoyed under despotism, end quote. So that's a snapshot of the kind of hijinks Jean-Paul gets up to. Just so you get a flavor of him at his most extreme, I thought I'd read you the string of metaphors that opens the 11th dog post today. Quote, Voltaire, who never could write a good comedy, would not have been competent to create this 11th dog post day. In regard to the 11th dog post day, I remark, to be sure, that nature has created plants with all varieties of numbers of stamens, only none with 11, and seldom also men with 11 fingers. Meanwhile, life, like shellfish, tastes best in months without R. In reply to this, some say that the pen of an author goes like a watch, the faster, the longer it has been going. But I reverse it and say rather, men who write much make fast writers. And yet people cannot well bear men who are the 5th wheel of a coach, but every baggage wagon has a 5th wheel strapped on behind it, and in case of accident, this is a true wheel of fortune. Reinhold read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason 5 times before he understood it. I pledge myself to be more intelligible to him, and require to be read only half as often. To speak out freely, I cherish some contempt for a head full of elastic ideas, which jump with their spring feet from one cerebral chamber to another, for I find no difference between them and the elastic worms in the intestines, which Goethe saw before light jump to the height of 3 inches. End quote. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. So this kind of freewheeling narrative intricacy was a major influence on Schumann. In the novels he wrote instead of going to class, Schumann even adopted Jean-Paul's use of dashes to string endless sentences together. It's also apparent in his early piano music. Just think of the riddles of Davidsbüttler, or Carnival, and how the theme from Papillon, a totally different piece, is interpolated mid-phrase. Papillon, by the way, was explicitly based on a Jean-Paul novel, Flegeljahre, which roughly translates to uncouth adolescence, which is probably about right for Schumann at that age. Anyway, so today is supposed to be about the Humoreske as well. The Humoreske, it requires a little translation to get at its literary roots. To modern ears, the title suggests wit, but Schumann called it, quote, perhaps my most melancholy work, end quote. This was one of the last pieces he wrote before marrying Clara Wieck, and he wrote to her, saying, quote, I have been at the piano all week, laughing and crying all at once. You will find the state of affairs nicely evoked in my Opus 20, the big Humoreske, end quote. So, laughing and crying in a Humoreske. It's not exactly slapstick, so what kind of humor are we talking? The humor Schumann is referring to is Jean-Paul's. Surprise, surprise! In addition to all his novels, Jean-Paul also wrote an Introduction to Aesthetics, where he clearly defines many of the concepts that suffuse his works. Jean-Paul described humor as the contrast of the infinite world and the small world, or the world as it is, and that this contrast provokes laughter containing both pain and greatness. It's a sort of spiritualized irony. In Jean-Paul's novels, this duality takes the form of high and low styles, contrasting idealistic reflections on elevated topics with realistic depictions of an all too finite world. To show you this special type of humor, I have just one more excerpt from Jean-Paul. I know, it's a relief. An excerpt from Quintus Fixlein, a novel-length idyll, also from 1795. In this novel, Fixlein is a mid-ranking teacher at a German gymnasium, or high school equivalent. The excerpt begins with the conclusion of a preposterously extravagant love scene. This elevated scene is then followed immediately by an intentionally tedious, drawn-out account of school teacher salaries, debt forgiveness, and even a table of figures. This is how it starts. Quote, "Oh now, when it struck 12, the hour of death, did not the lover fancy that her lips were drawing his soul away, and all the fibers and all the nerves of his life closed spasmodically round the last heart in this world, round the last rapture of existence? Yes, happy man, thou didst express thy love, for in thy love thou thoughtest to die." However, he did not die. Outside the grove of their betrothment, they felt as if a whole wide past had sunk away in a convulsion of the world. All was new, light, and young. The sky stood full of glittering dewdrops from the everlasting morning, and the stars quivered joyfully asunder and sank, resolved into beams, down into the hearts of men. The moon, with her fountain of light, had overspread and kindled all the garden, and was hanging above in a starless blue, as if she had consumed the nearby stars. And she seemed like a smaller wandering spring, like a Christ's face smiling in love of man. Under this light, they looked at one another for the first time, and after the first words of love, and the sky gleamed magically down on the disordered features with which the first rapture of love was still standing written on their faces. Dream, ye beloved, as ye wake, happy as in paradise, innocent as in paradise. End quote. So that chapter ends there, followed by the seventh note box. Like the other novel, Hesperus, this novel's chapters are also paper-related. In German, it's Zettelkasten, meaning essentially a box of files, which were ostensibly discovered and then assembled into a novel. It's a common conceit of German romantic novels, this kind of found narrative. He continues, quote, "Seventh note box. The finest thing was his awakening in his European settlement in the giant Shadek bed. The only thing that troubled him was that it was Monday and that he must go back to school." End quote. I hate Mondays, am I right? Okay, anyway, quote, "His first expedition after school hours was to the house of Meister Steinberger, where, without speaking a word, Fixlein counted down 50 florins cash in ducats on the table. 'At last I repay you,' said Fixlein, 'the moiety of my debt, and give you many thanks.' 'Eh, Herr Conrector,' said the quartermaster, and continued calmly eating his pudding. 'In my bond it is said payable at 3 months' mutual notice. How could a man like me go on else? However, I will change you the gold pieces.' Thereupon he advised Fixlein that it might be more judicious to take back a florin or two and buy himself a better hat and whole shoes." End quote. Then there are several pages discussing debts and the issue of schoolmaster salaries in German-speaking states. The funniest of which is this one, which, I'm sorry, I have to dramatize a little to bring out the insane amount of parentheticals and dashes. Quote, "The remarks I made on this subject to a prince, as well as the remarks a city attorney made on it to myself, are too remarkable to be admitted for the mere dread of digressiveness. The attorney, a man of enlarged views and of fiery patriotism, the warmth of which was the more beneficent that he collected all the beams of it into one focus and directed them to himself and his family, gave me," I had perhaps been comparing the school bench and the school stair to the bench and the ladder on which people are laid when about to be tortured, "the best reply. If a schoolmaster consume nothing but 30 Reichstalers, if he annually purchase manufactured goods, according as political economists have calculated for each individual, namely to the amount of 5 Reichstalers, and no more hundredweights of victuals than these assume, namely 10, in short, if he live like a substantial woodcutter, then the devil must be in it, if he cannot yearly lay by so much net profit as shall, in the long run, pay the interest of his entry debts. The attorney must have failed to convince me at the time, since afterwards I spoke about it to the Flachsenfingen prince," end quote, who, this prince, the narrator relates in a footnote that he knows him personally, and would have been happy to discuss that here, but it will be described in a work called Dog Post Days, aka Hesperus, the other novel I read to you, here presented with no explanation of the crazy title, and totally blurring the line between author, narrator, between real life and fiction. So he told the prince, quote, "Illustrious sir, you know not, but I do. No player in your theater would be willing to act the schoolmaster in Engel's play Prodigal Son for 3 nights running for the paltry sum that every real schoolmaster has to accept for acting this role all the days of the year. In Prussia, invalids are made schoolmasters. With us, schoolmasters are made invalids." End quote. No, continue the quote. "But back to our story." Fixlein proceeded to write out the inventory of his crown debts. End quote. Okay, from a Tristan-esque love scene to I hate Mondays is pretty much the essence of humor in Jean-Paul. Schumann was very aware of this kind of humor. He wrote about it in notebooks and letters, specifically referencing Jean-Paul. It's also quite evident musically in the Humoreske. So today I'm playing just the second half of the piece. It's hard to divide up the Humoreske since it doesn't have the separately numbered or titled pieces like Schumann's other works, just these extra thin double bar lines rather than full stops. These extra thin double bar lines are kind of reminiscent of dashes used to string Jean-Paul novels together. The mosaic of pieces in the second half have some very vivid examples of humor, so due to the time constraints here, I'm unfortunately foregoing the beautiful opening of the piece. By the way, go check out Radu Lupu's live recordings of this piece on YouTube. They're just unbelievably good. So the second half, it's about 14 minutes, right in the middle of the piece, starts with a poignant passage marked with one of Schumann's favorite indirections, Innig, or intimate, inward. But that interior character doesn't completely dominate. Right away, you'll hear this quirky alternation of ideas. Like one of Jean-Paul's unrelated asides inserted where it doesn't belong, the wistful melody jerks without warning into a scampering, impulsive passage that then melts away as quickly as it appears. After this section winds to a close, we're plunged headlong into an extended, whirring build-up full of suspenseful twists and turns. Things come to a head, and there's an apotheosis, a pinnacle of brilliant sound and pure excitement. But Schumann pulls the rug out from under us. The climax has barely finished ringing before a mock-serious march barges in, something grotesque and clearly parodic. It's marked with some pomp, and really it's hardly more than an emphatic bass line and modulating repetitive fanfare. This is the largest scale example of humor that you'll hear today. Something so extravagant, like the love scene in Quintus Fixlein, this gratuitous, almost gratuitous climax is immediately undercut by a pompous march. It's not really laugh out loud, but nor is it meant to be. The sheer strangeness of it all breaks the usual narrative frame with these irreconcilable opposites, which is what the last section is for. It's titled Zum BeschluB, meaning to the end, or to the resolution. It seems to ponder the extraordinary events that transpired, searching for answers. Its endless digressions cogitating over some unsolved problem, probably the polar tension between the infinite world and our daily reality. Even the typography suggests the centrality of this section. In the first edition, the phrase Zum BeschluB is the only tempo marking of the whole piece that's actually centered over a section, rather than off to the side, like usual. In literary terms, different analogies here bring out different aspects. Jean-Paul loved to have appendices that actually continue the plot, but calling this music an appendix might make it seem too ancillary, because it's not a sideshow. There's a strong sense of epilogue here, something absolutely genuine and heartfelt. And finally, a brief and grand valedictory allegro brings this narrative epic to a ringing conclusion. Okay, thanks for letting me talk your ears off. I hope you found it interesting. I know it's kind of a deep dive into something almost alien, but it is rewarding if you take the time. Oh, and do not forget to donate at one of the BIPOC Arts Org's links that are in the comments, and let us know which one you chose and how much you gave. Please, it's important. Okay, I'll be right back to perform the second half of Schumann's Humoreske. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions or just want to hang out, I'll be in the chat right after this. Thank you.